The first thing Tamsin noticed wasn't the scream of the turbine or the erratic spin of the horizon through the open bay door. It was the condensation on the inside of her wristwatch. A tiny fog patch obscuring the second hand, expanding and contracting with every ragged breath she took. It didn't belong there. It was a flaw in a sealed system, and right now, the entire world felt like a sealed system that had just been breached. Gravity lurched sideways. The Black Hawk didn't just bank. It shuddered like a dying animal, throwing the collective weight of 6 men against the port side webbing. The medical bag Tamsin had strapped to the deck plate tore free, sliding across the non-slip floor and slamming into the boots of the team leader, Master Chief Brannigan. He didn't look down. His eyes were locked on the cockpit, wide and unblinking, veins cording in a neck thick with muscle and grime. "Pull up," Brannigan roared, his voice cracking against the mechanical shriek of the engine. "Kest, pull the damn collective!" There was no answer from the front, just the wet, static hiss of an open mic and the terrifying sound of the cyclic stick vibrating against a dead weight. Tamsin tried to stand, but the G-force pinned her to the jump seat. She was 24, with hands that had stopped trembling only 3 weeks ago during her first IV insertion in a combat zone. She wasn't supposed to be here. This was a hot extract, a snatch and grab gone wrong in a valley that wasn't on the maps, and she was only aboard because the regular corpsman had taken shrapnel in the staging area. "We're going to die!" The shout didn't come from Brannigan. It came from the youngest operator, a kid named Harrow who couldn't have been older than Tamsin. He was staring out the door as the grey slate of the mountain wall rushed up to meet them, rotating in a sickening blur. It wasn't a tactical call. It was a statement of fact. The helicopter dipped the nose violently. The sudden drop floated Tamsin's stomach into her throat. She saw the pilot's helmet then. Kest. It was lolling to the left, banging rhythmically against the armored glass of the side window. A dark, viscous streak was already mapping a path down the back of his flight suit.
"He's hit!"
Tamsin yelled, unbuckling her harness. The click of the release sounded like a gunshot in the cabin. "Kest is hit." She scrambled forward, fighting the centrifugal force that wanted to throw her out the open door. She grabbed the back of the pilot's seat, her knuckles white, her fingernails biting into the Kevlar weave. The cockpit smelled of copper and burnt wiring. Kest was slumped forward, his body effectively locking the flight controls in a death dive. Brannigan was right behind her, struggling to keep his footing on the tilting deck. "Get him off the stick!" he bellowed. Tamsin reached over the seat. Her hand, trained to be gentle, trained to find veins in the arms of crying children, grabbed Kest by the shoulder harness. She pulled. He didn't move. His weight was dead, heavy and immovable against the forward tilt of the machine. She looked at the instrument panel. She didn't know what half the gauges meant, but she knew what the red light flashing LO RPM signified. And she knew what the ground looked like when it was 5 seconds away. The windshield was filled with rock. Jagged, unforgiving granite. "I can't move him!" Tamsin screamed, looking back at Brannigan. The veteran cell's face was pale, stripped of the invincible aura he had worn on the ground. He looked at the controls, then at her. He didn't know how to fly. None of them did. The realization hit Tamsin with the force of a physical blow. The DNA of her profession, the oath she had taken to do no harm, to preserve life, to treat the patient in front of her. All of it collided with the terrified eyes of 6 men in the back. If she treated Kest, they crashed. If she tried to move him gently, they crashed. The horizon flipped upside down. The warning chime of the radar altimeter began to scream a flat, continuous tone. She wasn't a pilot. She had watched Kest fly twice. She knew the theory of lift and drag from a college physics class she had barely passed. But as the granite filled the view, obliterating the sky, Tamsin realized she wasn't a nurse anymore, either. She was the only thing standing between these men and a fiery smear on the mountainside. She didn't think. She reached over the unconscious pilot, her small hands jamming between his armored chest and the control column. She felt the cold metal of the stick. It was slick with his blood. The cyclic stick didn't feel like a steering wheel. It felt like a jackhammer trying to tear itself out of the floor. Tamsin drove her left elbow into the pilot's ribs, a brutal, necessary violation of every instinct she possessed as a healer. She wasn't trying to comfort him. She was trying to collapse his lung capacity just enough to make his body go slack. Kest groaned, a wet, bubbling sound that was lost under the roar of the transmission, but Tamsin felt the vibration of it through her own arm. His grip on the controls loosened for a fraction of a second. That was all she got. She yanked the stick back and to the right. The Black Hawk didn't glide. It stopped falling and started sliding. The tail boom whipped around, catching the air like a sail, throwing the entire cabin into a violent shudder. The gray wall of the mountain flashed past the side window, so close that Tamsin could see the individual fractures in the granite, the lichen clinging to the stone. She didn't blink. She couldn't. Her eyes were dried out, pinned open by adrenaline. Below them, the landing skids scraped the tops of ancient pine trees. The sound was a horrific, tearing screech, like metal claws dragging across a chalkboard. "Clear!" Harrow shouted from the back, his voice cracking. "We cleared it." Tamsin didn't celebrate. She was wrestling a 4-ton beast that wanted to flip over. She leveled the stick, her movements jerky and unrefined. The helicopter porpoised, the nose pitching up and down in a nauseating rhythm. She could feel the sweat running down her spine, cold and stinging. Then came the resistance. Under her hand, the stick moved on its own. It jerked left hard. It wasn't the wind, it was Kest. This was the variable she hadn't calculated. The pilot wasn't fully unconscious. His brain, starving for oxygen and flooded with shock, had reverted to muscle memory. He was trying to fly, but his inner ear was shattered. He thought they were banking right, so he was correcting left, straight into a death spiral. "He's fighting me!" Tamsin yelled, her voice unrecognizable to her own ears. "Hayes pushing us back down." Brannigan lunged into the cockpit space. His face was a mask of soot and sweat, a smear of oil across his forehead highlighting the sheer intensity of his stare. He looked at Kest, then at Tamsin. "Knock him out," Brannigan ordered. The command was flat, devoid of emotion. It was a tactical solution to a mechanical problem. Tamsin stared at him. She was a lieutenant junior grade in the medical corps. She had taken an oath to alleviate suffering. Kest was her patient. He was bleeding from a head wound, likely a depressed skull fracture. Striking him could kill him. It could drive bone fragments into his brain tissue. "I can't," she stammered. Fighting the stick as Kest's hand tightened again, his knuckles white, his grip like iron. The helicopter listed dangerously, the engine whining in protest. "Do it, or we all burn," Brannigan said. He didn't yell. The quietness of his voice was terrifying. The helicopter dipped again. The horizon tilted. Tamsin saw the tree line rushing up for the second time. The choice wasn't philosophical anymore. It was mathematical. 1 life versus 7. She looked at Kest's helmet. She looked at the vulnerable exposed skin at the nape of his neck, right below the Kevlar rim. She let go of the collective with her left hand, losing altitude instantly. She made a fist, thumb outside the fingers, rigid and hard. "Forgive me," she whispered. She drove her fist into the cluster of nerves at the base of Kest's skull. It wasn't a medical strike. It was a desperate, forced trauma. Kest's head snapped forward. His body convulsed once, then went limp. His hand slid off the stick, falling uselessly into his lap. The controls went slack in her right hand. The resistance vanished. Tamsin grabbed the collective again and pulled. The engine screamed, the rotors bit into the air, and the Black Hawk shot upward, clearing the tree line and punching into the open blue sky. She leveled them out at 2,000 feet. The cabin was suddenly, strangely stable. The vibration smoothed out into a steady, rhythmic thrum. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence in the headset was heavier than the screaming had been. Tamsin stared at her own hand, the one that had just assaulted a dying officer. It was shaking violently. She checked the instrument panel. The Lalomabu RPM light had flickered off, but a new amber caution light was glowing steadily on the far right. She squinted at the text, her vision blurring. YPMP1FAIL. "We're level," she said, her voice hollow. "But we're leaking hydraulic fluid. I can feel the pedals getting stiff." The Brannigan didn't respond to the technical report. He leaned in close, his face inches from hers. He didn't look at the controls. He looked at Kest's slumped form, then directly into Tamsin's eyes. "You're not a nurse right now." "Lieutenant," Brannigan said, his voice low enough that the men in the back couldn't hear. "You keep this bird in the air. If he wakes up again, you put him down again. Do you understand me?" Tamsin looked at the blood on Kest's flight suit. It was soaking into the fabric, turning the green Nomex black. She had caused that fresh surge. She had deepened the fracture. "I understand," she said, but as she gripped the cyclic, she realized the condensation on her watch was gone. The glass was clear. She could see time moving again, and every second of it felt like a judgment. The silence in the cockpit was worse than the screaming. It was a vacuum, sucking the adrenaline out of the air and leaving only the cold, hard math of their altitude. Tamsin stared at the horizon, her eyes burning from the unblinking focus. She could feel the dried blood on the cyclic stick tacky against her palm, a constant, gritty reminder of the man she had assaulted to keep them alive. Behind her, the squad was shifting. The frantic energy of the crash avoidance had settled into a grim, professional waiting game. Tamsin glanced over her shoulder. Harrow was checking his weapon, sliding the bolt back and forth with a rhythmic, metallic clack that grated on her nerves. Next to him sat Holt, the team's heavy weapons specialist. Holt was a giant of a man, his shoulders so wide they brushed both sides of the troop's seat. But it was his hands that caught Tamsin's attention. He was methodically tightening the Velcro strap on his glove, pulling it until the leather creaked, then ripping it open and doing it again. Pull, silence, rip. It was a tick, a nervous loop born of helplessness. "How's he doing?" Tamsin asked, her voice sounding thin in the headset. Holt stopped the Velcro ritual. He leaned forward, placing 2 fingers on Kest's carotid artery. "Pulse is thready LT. He's breathing, but it's shallow. We need a trauma center. 10 minutes ago." 10 minutes. Tamsin looked at the navigation display. The GPS was a spider web of waypoints she didn't understand, but the compass heading was clear. "We're heavy," she said. "I can feel the drag. Every time I adjust the collective, The tail wants to swing. Just hold it steady, Brannigan said from the co-pilot's seat. He had strapped himself in, his presence a heavy, brooding weight beside her. He wasn't looking at the mountains anymore. He was watching the warning panel like it was an enemy combatant. The miracle happened. The amber HYDPMP1FAL light flickered, once, twice, and then it went dark. Tamsin blinked, sure she was hallucinating. She tapped the glass of the instrument cluster. The light stayed off. The ominous glow that had signaled their imminent mechanical death was gone. "The light's out," she whispered. Brannigan leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Did we lose the circuit?" "Oh, no," Tamsin said, her heart leaping into her throat. "Look at the pressure gauge. The needle is climbing. It's back in the green. The backup pump must have cycled and primed the primary line." A wave of relief washed over the cabin, so palpable it felt like a change in cabin pressure. It was a false dawn, a seduction of hope that Tamsin was desperate to believe. If the hydraulics were back, she wasn't flying a broken coffin anymore. She was flying a machine that wanted to stay in the air. "That's it," Brannigan said, and for the first time, the granite edge in his voice softened. "God looks out for fools and frogmen. We've got the bird back. Outpost Sierra, this is Black Hawk 2-0. Brannigan keyed the mic, his voice booming with renewed authority. "We are green on systems, requesting immediate vector for surgical extract. We have a code red casualty." The radio crackled, static washing over them before a clear, calm voice cut through. 0, this is Sierra. We have you on the tracker. Wind is calm. Surgical team is standing by on the pad. You are 7 mics out. Bring him home. 7 minutes. Tamsin did the math. If the bird was healthy, she could push the nose down, trade altitude for airspeed, and cut that time in half. She could get Kess to a surgeon before the brain swelling became irreversible. She could undo the damage her fist had caused. "I'm pushing it," Tamsin said, her confidence surging. She felt the controls respond. The stiffness in the pedals seemed to vanish. The cyclic moved with a fluid grace she hadn't felt since takeoff. "Do it," Brannigan ordered. "Get us on the deck." Tamsin eased the stick forward. The Black Hawk responded instantly, the nose dropping, the airspeed indicator climbing past 120 knots. The ground rushed by faster, a blur of brown and green. She wasn't just surviving now, she was flying. She felt a strange, intoxicating connection to the machine. The vibration in the seat felt less like a shudder and more like a purr. "I see the pad," Harrow shouted from the back. 1 o'clock, low! I see the cross." There it was. A white concrete square painted with a red cross, nestled in the valley floor like a target. It looked safe. It looked like forgiveness. Tamsin banked the helicopter, lining up for the approach. The movement was smooth. Too smooth. She didn't notice that the HYDPUMP light hadn't just turned off. The MIMASTER 2 iron light next to it had failed to illuminate when she banked hard. She didn't notice that the pressure needle hadn't just climbed to the green. It was pinned there, frozen, not vibrating with the engine's hum. She was trusting a lie. "Descending," she announced. "Hang on, Kest. We're almost there." She pulled back on the cyclic to bleed off speed, expecting the nose to flare up and break their momentum. The stick moved back in her hand. It was light, weightless. It slid all the way to her stomach with zero resistance. The nose of the helicopter didn't rise. It stayed pitched down, locked on a collision course with the valley floor at 100 knots. Tamsin stared at the stick in her lap, disconnected from the rotors above. The silence in the cockpit returned, but this time It was the silence of a severed nerve. The light hadn't gone out because the system was fixed. The light had gone out because the sensor had just run dry. "Hydraulics hard over!" Tamsin screamed, her voice tearing at her throat. The fluid didn't come back. The valve just blew. She slapped the overhead panel, her fingers finding the guarded switch for the flight control servos. She flipped it. The artificial feel of the stick vanished, replaced instantly by the raw, crushing weight of the rotor blades. It was like trying to lift a car axle with one hand. The cyclic snapped to the left, following the torque of the main rotor, dragging the helicopter into a spiral toward the valley floor. "Help me!" Tamsin yelled. She had both boots jammed against the pedals, her entire body weight hanging off the stick, but it wouldn't budge. The mountainside was spinning faster, a kaleidoscope of grey rock and green pine. Brannigan didn't ask questions. He threw his massive hands onto the dual controls on his side. "On my mark. 3, 2, pull! Wait!" Tamsin saw the airspeed indicator. 140 knots. If they pulled back hard now, without the hydraulic dampeners, the G-force would be catastrophic. Not for them. They were strapped in. But for Kest. "The G-load," she shouted, staring at the pilot's slumped head. "His intracranial pressure is already maxed out. If we pull 4 Gs, we'll kill him. We'll stroke him out right here." Brannigan didn't look at Kest. He looked at the granite wall filling the windscreen. "If we don't pull, we're all dead in 6 seconds. Pull the stick, Lieutenant." It was the choice she had dreaded since nursing school. The triage of the damned. To save the many, she had to execute the one. The oath to do no harm shattered against the reality of the altimeter. Tamsin closed her eyes for a millisecond, a private, agonizing apology to the universe. "Pull!" she screamed. She hauled back with everything she had. Brannigan roared, the veins in his neck bulging like steel cables as he added his strength to hers. The nose of the Black Hawk reared up. The G-force hit them like a physical hammer. The world turned grey. Tamsin's chin was forced down onto her chest. Her flak vest felt like it was made of lead. The air was squeezed out of her lungs. Beside her, Kest's body reacted instantly. He didn't groan. He seized. His back arched against the straps, his legs kicking out in a violent, rigid spasm that slammed against the instrument panel. "Keep pulling." Brannigan snarled through gritted teeth. Tamsin felt a pop in her shoulder, a sharp, hot tear in the muscle, but she didn't let go. She kept pulling until the grey washed out of her vision and the blue sky reappeared. The vibration was deafening, the rotor blades slapping the air in protest, but they were level. They were alive. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding and immediately looked at Kest. He was still. Too still. The seizure had stopped. Tamsin reached out with a trembling hand. Her right hand, the one that had guided the stick, and touched his neck. His skin was clammy. She pressed her fingers into the groove of his throat, searching for the rhythm she knew better than her own heartbeat. Nothing. She waited. Second. 3. Silence under her fingertips. "He's gone," she whispered. The words tasted like ash. She had done it. She had technically saved the aircraft, but the torque of the turn and the crushing pressure of the pull had forced the brain stem down. She had finished what the enemy bullets started. "Eyes on the horizon," Brannigan said. His voice was rough, stripped of the earlier adrenaline. He knew. He didn't look at the body. He kept his eyes forward, enforcing the mission, refusing to let her mourn. "Sierra, this is 2-0. Brannigan keyed the mic, his tone flat. "We are stabilizing. Inbound to pad. The response from the ground cut through the headset, sharp and frantic. -20! Wave off! Repeat. Wave off. Tamsin's head snapped up. Say again, Sierra. Brannigan barked. The LZ is compromised? The voice on the radio shouted, panic bleeding through the static. We took mortars on the pad! The surgical team is down! You have no reception committee! Do not land here! Repeat, do not land. Tamsin looked at the white concrete square below them. Smoke was drifting across the Red Cross. The safe haven she had killed her patient to reach was gone. Where do we go? Harrow called from the back, his voice rising in pitch. We're leaking fuel! We can't stay up! Tamsin looked at the fuel gauge. The needle was bouncing near the red line. They had traded altitude for speed and speed for life, and now they had nowhere to put the machine down. She looked at Kest's body last time. He was slumped forward again, released from his pain, leaving her alone with the controls of a broken helicopter and 5 men who thought the worst was over. We don't have enough fuel to make the base, Tamsin said, her voice eerily calm. And without hydraulics, I can't hover. We can't land slow. She looked at Brannigan. We have to crash it, she said, on purpose. Thrash it, Brannigan repeated, the order hanging in the humid cabin air like smoke. Find a spot. Put it on the ground before we fall out of the sky. Tamsin scanned the valley floor through the chin bubble. Her arms were screaming. Without the hydraulic assist, holding the cyclic stick in position required every ounce of strength in her upper body. It felt like she was wrestling a live bull that wanted to roll over and crush them. The muscles in her shoulders were knotted tight, burning with a lactic fire that made her vision swim. I can't flare. She gritted out, her voice tight. If I pull the nose up to slow us down, the rotor RPM will dump. We'll drop like a rock from whatever altitude we're at. We have to slide it on. Slide where? Harrow yelled from the back. The whole valley is rocks. We'll tear the belly off. There, Tamsin said, jerking her chin toward a narrow, grey strip of dried riverbed running parallel to the tree line. It was littered with boulders the size of cars, but it was flat and it was long enough, the wash. It's the only place we fit. That's a suicide run, Holt rumbled, his voice vibrating through the floorboards. That gravel is loose. We hit that at 80 knots. We roll. We don't have a choice. Tamsin snapped. The authority in her voice surprised her. It wasn't the tentative suggestion of a junior officer. It was the command of a pilot in command. The fuel light is solid red. The engines are going to flame out in less than a minute. If that happens while we're over the trees, we die. If it happens over the rocks, we die. I'm putting it in the wash. She didn't wait for Brannigan's approval. She shoved the stiff, heavy pedals to the left, banking the Black Hawk toward the riverbed. The helicopter groaned, a metallic protest that shuddered through the airframe. The vibration was getting worse. The main rotor was out of track, likely damaged from the G-force of the pull that had killed Kest. Tamsin broadcasted to the empty airwaves. Brace for impact. Lock your inertial reels. Head down. Arms in. The ground rushed up to meet them. The riverbed looked less like a landing strip and more like a grender. Airspeed 110, Brannigan called out. Too fast, Tamsin, you're too fast! I know, she yelled back. I can't slow down without stalling. So she lined up the nose with the grey streak of gravel. The trees on either side were a green blur. She was threading a needle with a 4-ton sledgehammer. Then, the micro twist hit. Wires! Harrow screamed. Chables! 12 o'clock! Crossing the wash? Tamsin squinted. There, barely visible against the grey stone, a thick, rusted logging cable was strung across the riverbed, right at rotor height. It was a trap, a remnant of some old operation, invisible until you were right on top of it. If they hit it, it would shear the rotor head clean off. Under it, Brannigan shouted. No room. Tamsin saw the clearance. It was 5 feet off the ground.
We can't go under.
She had 2 seconds. She could pull up and stall into the trees, or she could do the one thing that went against every survival instinct she had left. Cutting power, she whispered. She reached up with her left hand, her only free hand, and grabbed the power control levers on the overhead quadrant. Brannigan lunged for her hand. We have to drop. Tamsin screamed, and she yanked the levers all the way back to OFF. The screaming whine of the engines died instantly. The sudden silence was more violent than the noise. The torque vanished. The nose of the helicopter swung wildly to the right, no longer fighting the engine's power. Deprived of drive, the Black Hawk stopped flying and started falling. It dropped 20 feet in a heartbeat, plunging straight down, underneath the level of the deadly cable. The skids hit the gravel with a force that shattered Tamsin's teeth together. The sound was a deafening, grinding roar. The landing gear collapsed instantly. The belly of the helicopter slammed into the riverbed, skipping off a boulder and slamming down again. The windshield imploded, showering the cockpit with safety glass. They were sliding, skidding across the loose rock at 60 miles an hour, a chaotic, sparking sled ride through hell. Tamsin was thrown forward against her straps, the breath knocked out of her, but she kept her hands on the dead controls, fighting to keep the machine upright as it plowed through the stones. Dust and rocks sprayed into the open cockpit. The noise was a continuous, terrifying screech of tearing metal. Then the tail boom clipped a larger boulder. The world spun. The helicopter pirouetted violently, the tail whipping around. The centrifugal force pinned Tamsin to the side of the cockpit. She saw the tree line flashing past, then the sky, then the rocks, then the sky again. Roll, someone screamed. The Black Hawk tipped. The main rotor blades, still spinning from inertia, struck the ground. As she got. The sound was like artillery fire. The blades shattered, sending shrapnel tearing through the canopy. The helicopter rolled onto its right side, grinding into the earth, sliding another 50 feet, before coming to a shuddering, jarring halt. Dust billowed up, choking the air. The smell of raw jet fuel flooded the cabin instantly. Tamsin hung sideways in her straps, staring at the instrument panel, which was now dark and lifeless. Her left arm was numb. Blood was dripping into her eye from a cut on her forehead. She was alive. "Sound off!" Brannigan's voice croaked from somewhere below her. He was hanging in the co-pilot's seat, which was now hovering a few inches above the dirt. Harrow clear. A cough from the back. Halt clear. My leg's pinned, but I'm clear. Tamsin fumbled with her buckle. Her fingers felt like sausages, clumsy and unresponsive. She looked to her right, toward the pilot's seat. Kest's body had not been so lucky. The impact had thrown him against the shattered side window. The collapse of the structure had pinned him in a way that made Tamsin's stomach churn. He was gone before the crash, she told herself. "He was already gone, fire!" Holt shouted. "Ah, smell fire!" "Get out!" Brannigan roared, unbuckling and dropping to the dirt. "Everyone out!" "Move." Tamsin hit the release. She fell out of the seat, landing hard on Brannigan's shoulder before tumbling onto the rocky ground. She scrambled on her hands and knees, crawling through the jagged glass and twisted metal of the shattered windshield. She dragged herself into the open air, gasping, coughing up dust. She stood up, swaying, and turned back to the wreck. Smoke was curling from the engine cowling. A small lick of orange flame danced near the fuel tank. "Get Holt," she screamed, stumbling toward the back door. The fuselage was bent, the door jammed half open. She could see Holt inside, struggling to free his heavy leg from under the crumpled troop seat. She grabbed the edge of the door frame and pulled. It didn't budge. "He's stuck." Harrow was there, his face a mask of blood and dirt, pulling alongside her. "Pull?" Tamsin yelled. They heaved together. The metal groaned, screeching as it bent just enough. Holt yanked his leg free, howling in pain, and tumbled out of the aircraft, landing in the dirt at Tamsin's feet. "Run," Brannigan ordered. "It's gonna blow." They scrambled away, dragging Holt across the riverbed. Their boots slipping on the loose stones. They made it to the cover of the tree line just as the fuel tank cooked off. Boom! The explosion wasn't Hollywood. It was a dull, heavy wimp of pressure that knocked the wind out of them. A ball of heat rolled over their backs. Tamsin hit the dirt, covering her head. When she looked up, the Black Hawk was a bonfire. The metal skeleton was blackening in the intense heat. She stared at the flames. Kest was still inside. She had killed him with the G-force. Then she had dropped him from the sky. And now she was burning him. She had saved the squad. She had brought them to the ground alive. But as she watched the fire consume the cockpit, Tamsin felt something inside her chest fracture permanently. The nurse who had boarded that helicopter was dead. The person shivering in the tree line was someone else entirely. The fire didn't burn out, it just changed shifts with the darkness. As the sun dipped below the canyon rim, the wreckage of the Black Hawk became a glowing, skeletal lantern in the twilight, casting long, twisting shadows against the rocks. Tamsin sat 20 yards away, her back against a cold boulder, her hands busy with Holt's leg. She wasn't shaking anymore. The tremor that had plagued her during the flight, the fear that had vibrated in her bones, was gone. In its place was a flat, icy precision. She was sewing Holt's skin back together with a field needle, the thread pulling tight through the gristle and muscle of his thigh. She didn't apologize when he hissed in pain. She didn't offer words of comfort. She just worked, her movements mechanical, stripping away the humanity of the act until it was just plumbing and carpentry. "You're good at that." Holt grunted, his face gray in the fading light. "Better than the last guy." "The last guy is dead," Tamsin said. Her voice was unrecognizable. It didn't sound like the woman who had begged Brannigan not to make her fly. It sounded like the machine she had just destroyed. Brannigan stood guard at the edge of the wash, his weapon scanning the tree line. He hadn't spoken since they cleared the blast zone. He was a silhouette of violence, a statue carved from regret and discipline. He walked over, the crunch of his boots on the gravel loud in the sudden quiet. "We need to move," Brannigan said, looking down at Tamsin's handiwork. "That fire is a beacon. If there are hostiles in the valley, they know exactly where we are." "I can't walk," Tamsin said, tying off the suture with a sharp tug, "not far. His femur is intact, but the muscle is shredded. If we move him fast, he bleeds out. Then we carry him," Brannigan replied. "Harrow, take point. We head for the high ground." Harrow didn't move. He was kneeling by his pack, fiddling with the long whip antenna of the portable SET COM radio. It was the only piece of comms gear that had survived the crash, protected inside his ruck. "Skipper," Harrow whispered, The urgency in his voice stopped Brannigan mid-stride. "I've got a signal. It's weak, but it's digital." Someone squawking on the primary net. Tamsin felt a dull thud in her chest. Rescue. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like an accusation. "Put it on speaker," Brannigan ordered, crouching down. Harrow twisted the volume knob. Static hissed through the small speaker, popping and crackling like dry wood in a fire. Then a voice cut through. Clear. Calm. American. Sierra Base to Black Hawk 2-0. 2-0, acknowledge. We are holding position on the surgical pad. Where are you? Tamsin's hands froze over her medical kit. She looked up, her eyes locking with Brannigan's. Say again. Sierra. Brannigan grabbed the handset, his knuckles white. This is 2-0 actual. We waved off. You called the zone compromised. You took mortars. Over. There was a pause on the line. A silence that stretched for 5 seconds, heavy enough to crush lungs. Negative. 2-0. The voice from Sierra returned, confused and sharp. We have been cold on the pad for 20 minutes. No mortars. No contact. We watched you approach and then break off. We thought you had a mechanical. Why did you divert? Over. The world tilted again. Worse than it had in the air. Tamsin stared at the radio. The realization hit her with the force of the G-load she had pulled. The voice, she whispered. The voice that told us to wave off, it wasn't them? Electronic warfare, Harrow said, his face draining of color. Someone spoofed the frequency. They waited until we were on final approach, then injected a fake transmission to scare us off. Brannigan dropped the handset. It swung by its cord, hitting the rocks with a dull clack. Tamsin looked at the burning wreckage in the distance. The fire was still consuming the cockpit. It was all for nothing. The G-force pull that had snapped Kess's brainstem. Unnecessary. The desperate dive into the wash. Unnecessary. The crash that had incinerated her patient. Unnecessary. They could have landed. The compromised LZ was a lie. A ghost story told over the airwaves by an enemy sitting comfortably on a ridgeline, watching them destroy themselves. She had killed a man to save the squad from a threat that didn't exist. She had chosen the hard, brutal path, the path of the heroic pilot, because she was trying to be obedient to the tactical reality. But the reality was a fabrication. We killed him, Tamsin said. She didn't scream it. She stated it like a diagnosis. We killed him for a prank call. Lieutenant. Brannigan started, stepping toward her, his hand reaching out. Don't, she snapped, recoiling from his touch. She stood up, her legs feeling like they didn't belong to her. She looked at her hands. They were covered in Holt's blood, but under the red, she could still feel the phantom vibration of the cyclic stick. She had felt so proud, for a fleeting second, that she had made the hard choice. That she had the stomach to do what was necessary, but courage without truth wasn't heroism. It was just manslaughter. The radio crackled again. 2-0, advise status. Do you require extract? We see a fire in the wash. Is that you? Tamsin looked at the fire. The heat was scorching her face, drying the tears she refused to shed. The fracture in her soul widened, cracking all the way to the foundation. She realized then that the war hadn't just taken her innocence. It had taken her judgment. It had made her a weapon and then tricked her into firing on her own conscience. Tell them, she said, her voice hollow, drifting away like the smoke. Tell them we're here. Tell them the pilot is dead. And tell them the nurse. She died in the crash, too. The Brannigan stared at her, seeing the change in her eyes. The light was gone. The softness was gone. The rookie was gone. 2-0 copies. Brannigan said into the mic, his voice rough. "We are in the wash. 1 KIA. Requesting extract." He clicked the radio off. The silence rushed back in, louder than the explosion. Tamsin turned her back on the burning helicopter and walked into the dark, alone. The rescue helicopter didn't look like a savior. It looked like a predator, a dark shape descending from the stars with a spotlight that blinded them, turning the rocks white and the shadows absolute black. Tamsin shielded her eyes, the rotor wash whipping her hair across her face, stinging her skin with grit. She didn't look up at the machine. She looked down at the body bag next to her boots. It was heavy. Heavier than Kest had been when he was alive. 2 pararescue jumpers hit the ground, their boots crunching on the gravel, moving with the frantic, efficient speed of men who knew the clock was ticking. They didn't ask if she was okay. They saw the blood on her flight suit, the 1,000-yard stare, and the way she stood guard over the black zipper. They just nodded and went to work on Holt. "Load him first," Brannigan shouted over the noise, pointing at the heavy gunner. Tamsin watched them strap Holt into the litter. He was pale, his leg a mess of tourniquets and field dressings, but he was alive. He gave her a thumbs up as they hoisted him into the hovering bird. A thumb, a simple gesture that said, "You did this." She wanted to break his finger. She wanted to scream that she hadn't done anything but fall for a radio trick and execute a man who trusted her. "Your turn," a PJ yelled, grabbing her harness. "Take the pilot," she said. Her voice was flat, buried under the engine noise. "Take Kest." "We'll get the living first, man! Let's go!" He didn't wait for permission. He clipped a carabiner to her vest and yanked. Tamsin's feet left the ground. For a second, she was weightless again, swinging in the void, suspended between the earth she had crashed into and the sky she had failed to master. She looked down one last time. The wreckage of her helicopter was still burning, a dying ember in the vast, indifferent darkness of the valley. They hauled her into the cabin. It smelled of sterile gauze and aviation fuel. The exact same smell that had started her day. The loop was closed. The flight back to base was a blur of vibration and red tactical lights. Tamsin sat on the troop bench, her knees touching Brannigan's. The Master Chief was cleaning his weapon, wiping the dust from the receiver with a rag. It was a comfort ritual. He looked up, catching her eye. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a platitude. He just held her gaze for a long, heavy second, then nodded once. It was a seal of approval from a warrior to a warrior. It was an acknowledgement that she had crossed the line, done the math, and paid the bill. And that was the fracture. Tamsin realized, with a cold shock that settled deep in her gut, that she wanted his approval. Despite the lie, despite the death, despite the fact that she had crushed a man's skull to save the others, a part of her was proud that she had the strength to do it. That was the part that terrified her. That was the piece of her soul that had broken off and been replaced by something harder, something colder. The nurse who cried over lost patients was gone. In her place was someone who could weigh a life in one hand and a mission in the other, and not tremble when the scale tipped. They landed on the concrete pad at Sierra Base. The lights were blinding. Medical teams swarmed the aircraft. "Lieutenant, are you injured?" A flight surgeon was in her face, shining a penlight into her eyes. "No," Tamsin said, pushing the light away. "I'm not the patient." She walked past him. She walked past the stretcher where they were finally unloading Kest's body. She didn't stop to pray. She didn't stop to cry. She walked to the edge of the tarmac, where the darkness began again. She looked at her hands. They were trembling just a little. Not from fear, but from the residual vibration of the machine she had forced to the ground. She rubbed her thumb over her knuckles. They were bruised. They would heal. The bone would knit. The skin would fade to white. And in a year, there would be no physical sign of what she had done. But the silence would stay. The silence of that decision. The silence of the radio after the lie was revealed. She took a breath of the cool night air. It tasted like kerosene and ozone. She didn't hate it. Tamsin zipped up her jacket, hiding the blood on her flight suit, and turned back toward the lights of the command center. She had a report to file. She had a lie to explain. And she had a life to live that she hadn't earned, but that she would keep. Because that's what survival is. It's not a reward. It's a debt. And she would spend the rest of her life paying for the seat she occupied. We often think that doing the right thing leaves us feeling light, but sometimes the hardest right feels heavier than the wrong. Thank you for listening to this story and for carrying the weight of it with us today. If you believe that the truth is worth the cost, even when it hurts, go ahead and hit that subscribe button to join us for the next mission.